I booked a small Airbnb in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of a city I didn't know well. The listing promised a modern retreat with complete privacy, and the photos made it look perfect. A sleek exterior, clean lines, minimal furniture, and a small garden with potted plants neatly arranged along a narrow stone path. I arrived late in the afternoon, driving through streets lined with modest houses, their lights beginning to flicker on as the sun sank behind distant hills. The neighborhood was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with no children playing or cars moving past. I pulled up to the property and noticed how the small gravel driveway rattled under my tires, the sound echoing slightly in the empty street. The house itself was smaller than the photos suggested, but not uncomfortably so. It was a single-story structure, painted a pale gray, with large windows that reflected the fading light. I carried my bag up the short porch steps and unlocked the door with the code the host had texted me. The smell hit immediately. A faint, chemical odor mixed with the faint mustiness of a house that had been closed up for a while. Not unpleasant, but noticeable. Inside, the floor was polished wood, smooth and slightly cool to the touch, and the walls were painted white. The air was still, and it felt unusually quiet, almost oppressive in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The interior was minimal. A small living area with a low sofa, a coffee table, and a few abstract prints on the wall. The kitchen was compact, with stainless steel appliances, a small island, and cabinets that seemed new but didn't quite close smoothly. The bedroom was at the back, accessible through a narrow hallway, and it was small, just a bed against one wall, a dresser, and a closet. I set my bag down on the bed, opened the windows slightly, and leaned against the wall, stretching and taking in the space. The quiet was absolute, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and a distant, muffled sound of what I assumed was traffic somewhere far off. That night, I fell asleep after a long day of driving, but it didn't last. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a noise. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft scraping sound from somewhere in the house. I froze, listening, trying to convince myself it was a branch brushing against the window or the house settling. The sound came again, slightly louder, and I realized it was coming from the bedroom closet. My pulse quickened. The closet door was closed, but the sound was deliberate, slow, like something being moved inside. I grabbed my phone and shined a light at the door. Nothing moved. I told myself it had to be the pipes, the floorboards, anything but a person. Still, the unease settled in my chest like a heavy stone. I stayed awake for hours after that, my body rigid, my eyes fixed on the closet. Every small creak in the floor, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my heart race. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning brought light and a little relief, but also new discoveries. The closet door was slightly ajar, something I was sure I had closed. There were small scratches along the edge of the frame, shallow but fresh, as if the door had been pushed open from the inside. I cautiously pulled it open, revealing a narrow space barely big enough to stand in. The walls were bare, and dust had settled thickly on the floor. There was no one there now, but the thought of someone having been inside while I slept was unsettling. The room, which had seemed clean and safe in the daylight, now felt compromised, exposed in a way that was hard to shake. I packed my belongings quickly, my hands moving faster than my mind could follow. Every step through the house felt heightened, every creak underfoot a warning. I checked the windows, all locked, all intact, and walked slowly through the living area and kitchen one last time, my eyes scanning every corner. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt welcoming. I carried my bag back to the car, closing the door carefully behind me, and took a long look at the house from the gravel driveway. It looked the same as it had the afternoon before, neat and quiet, but my mind was no longer fooled. Something had been here, something human, and that thought lingered in my chest like a weight. I didn't go directly home. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, scanning every side street, every driveway. The streets were still quiet, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching, that someone could have been nearby the house while I was there. The thought made my hands clammy on the steering wheel and my pulse sharp in my ears. Eventually, I returned to a main road, the familiar traffic and lights of the city bringing some sense of safety, though the tension lingered. When I got home, I called Airbnb and reported the incident in detail. I described the scratches, the ajar door, the feeling of someone having been inside. I didn't want to assume anything, but I also wanted the listing investigated. Within a few days, the listing was removed. That detail brought some relief, a sense that I had avoided danger and that the company had taken action, but it didn't erase the experience. I found myself replaying the night over and over, imagining what could have happened if I hadn't checked the closet or if I had fallen asleep fully. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings whenever I traveled. I checked every corner of every place I stayed, examined closets and hidden spaces, made sure windows and doors were secure. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me careful, more observant, more deliberate. I realized how easily assumptions about safety could be wrong, how a place that looks perfect in photos can hide risks. The fear faded slowly over time, replaced by a sense of caution. I returned to Airbnb and stayed in other places, but I never again assumed privacy or security. I always looked deeper, examined details others might overlook, and stayed alert in ways I hadn't before. That night, in that quiet suburban house, had been a lesson in vigilance, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The ending was clear and concrete. I left the house safely, reported the incident, and the listing was removed. No one was harmed, no confrontations occurred, but I had learned something crucial. The world can seem safe, but vigilance is the only way to truly be secure. Every detail of that night, the scratches on the closet, the faint smell of chemicals, the soft sounds in the dark, remains vivid in my mind. They serve as both a warning and a reassurance, proof that paying attention can prevent disaster, that noticing small signs can make the difference between safety and danger. Even now, months later, I think about that house when I book a place to stay. I check the closet, inspect the locks, examine every hidden corner. The memory is uncomfortable but grounding, a clear lesson learned, and I can still feel the relief of leaving that house behind, driving away into the safety of the city lights, leaving the quiet, empty streets and that perfectly clean house behind me, forever part of my memory. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, scrolling through listings late at night, trying to find a quiet place to work for a week without distractions. The pictures looked decent enough. An old, two-story house tucked away at the edge of a small town, far from the highway, with a big yard and overgrown trees lining the property. The price was low, which should have been a warning, but I was tired of expensive city rentals. I told myself the isolation would help me focus. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The gravel driveway was uneven, and the tires of my car crunched loudly as I drove up. The house itself looked much older in person than in the photos. The paint was faded and peeling, and the front porch sagged slightly. A rusted mailbox leaned at an angle near the edge of the property. Despite all this, there was something strangely inviting about it, like it had been waiting for someone, anyone, to come along. I parked and stepped out, taking in the quiet. The air smelled damp, earthy, and a little musty. I could hear birds in the distance, though the noise felt muted, like I was in a soundproof bubble. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the front door using the code the host had sent. The interior smelled sharply of old wood and cleaning products, a mixture that made me hesitate for a second. Dust motes floated in the fading light coming through tall, narrow windows. The living room had mismatched furniture that looked functional but uncomfortable. A tattered sofa sat against one wall, and a wooden coffee table had scratches deep enough to catch my fingers if I ran them over it. The floors creaked under my weight. I walked through the house, checking the rooms, opening cabinets, peeking into the bathroom. Everything was old but usable. The kitchen had a faint odor of something sour, maybe spoiled food that had been cleaned up poorly. I didn't investigate too closely. I set up my laptop on the dining table and started working, telling myself I could ignore the strange noises that came from the house settling or the wind outside. But by the second night, I noticed things that didn't make sense. The first time, it was the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I was in the kitchen, washing a cup, and I could hear someone walking upstairs, though I knew I was alone. I froze, listening. The steps stopped. I waited a few minutes, then cautiously went upstairs. The floorboards were empty. Nothing had moved. Nothing had been disturbed. I chalked it up to my imagination. The next morning, I discovered small things out of place. A chair slightly rotated from where I'd left it. A towel on the bathroom counter folded differently than I had left it. I began to notice a pattern of subtle disturbances. Cabinets left slightly ajar. A book on the shelf moved an inch or two. At first, I thought I might be forgetting, absent-mindedly moving things myself. But as the day went on, I started keeping track. I would leave a small note on the counter or place a book in a particular position, then return later to find it moved. The isolation that had initially seemed appealing began to feel suffocating. There was no nearby store, no neighbor to look over the fence, no one to call if I felt unsafe. My phone signal was weak, and the Wi-Fi was inconsistent. Every creak in the floor, every rustle of leaves outside, made me tense. One night, around midnight, I woke to a loud thump from upstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. I lay still, listening. Then another thump, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I wanted to get up, but fear rooted me to the bed. After several minutes, the noise stopped. I waited, counting seconds. Nothing. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe the house was old and the attic had shifted. Maybe a branch had fallen on the roof. But as the days passed, I noticed more concrete evidence of intrusions. One afternoon, I went out to take a walk around the yard. When I returned, I found the front door unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. Inside, the living room rug had been tugged slightly, like someone had brushed past it. I began to feel hunted, though I had no idea by whom. I avoided staying in the house at night when possible. I left the doors locked and the lights on, sometimes sleeping in my car in the driveway. But there was no way to leave during the day, and I couldn't abandon the work I had come to do. On the fourth night, I set up a few small cameras around the house, hidden in corners. I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The next morning, I checked the footage. My stomach dropped. On one of the cameras in the living room, I saw someone inside. A figure, crouched near the back hallway, wearing dark clothing and gloves. They didn't move quickly, just slowly, deliberately checking drawers, touching items. They paused in the camera's view, looked directly at it, then walked out of frame. I checked the timestamps. This happened at 2:43 a.m. I had been sleeping. I had no idea how long they had been in the house before that. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I called the local police. They came within an hour. After a thorough search, they told me there were no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact. Windows were secure. The house had been entered through a back door that had a weak latch, one that could be lifted quietly if you knew it. It wasn't the first time they'd seen someone exploit that in the area. The police left, giving me advice to secure the property and perhaps not stay there alone. I canceled the rest of my stay. I packed everything in a rush, leaving behind books, a few dishes, and the sense of peace I had hoped to find. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of relief and violation. The house didn't look different from the road. It just sat there, quiet, innocent in appearance, but I knew what had happened inside. That night, I stayed in a motel in town. I didn't sleep well, jumping at every creak and knock, convinced someone had followed me. In the weeks after, I changed my locks at home, updated my security system, and double-checked every Airbnb review more carefully. I learned to trust my instincts, to recognize the subtle signs of danger even when nothing seems overtly threatening. And though the memory of that house lingered, I also realized something important. I had survived. I had been cautious when the first warning signs appeared, had documented evidence, and had acted decisively. Could have been much worse. Now, years later, I still think about that week. I can picture the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the dust in the sunlight. I remember the slow dread as I realized I wasn't entirely alone. But I also remember the calm clarity that came when I decided I wasn't going to wait for something worse to happen. That clarity, the decision to leave to reclaim control, was what saved me. The house was just a house. The threat was real, but it wasn't unknowable. And understanding that, I finally felt safe again. I booked the farmhouse Airbnb on a whim, drawn to the listing's promise of a rustic countryside experience. The photos were simple: weathered wood siding, a small porch with a swing, fields stretching in every direction. It was far enough from town to feel isolated, but close enough to the nearest highway that I didn't think twice about safety. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling up on a gravel driveway that crunched under the tires, and the air smelled of dry grass and faint smoke from nearby chimneys. The house was smaller than I expected, a single story with peeling white paint and a tin roof that looked like it had survived more than a few storms. Inside, the layout was basic: a small kitchen, a tiny living area, and the bedroom tucked in the back. The wood floors creaked when I walked, and the windows had that faint musty scent old houses carry, mixed with the faint sweetness of whatever air freshener the host had left. The bedroom was plain, furnished with a double bed, a small nightstand, and a closet that looked like it had been part of the original construction. The door was wooden, slightly warped, with a knob that resisted a little when I turned it. I didn't think much of it at first. I unpacked my bag and took a long look out the window, watching the sun sink behind a line of trees in the distance. Shadows stretched long across the yard, and the fields darkened to a muted green that almost looked black. As night fell, the house settled in a way old wood always does. Floors groaned, the roof whispered in the wind, and I could hear a faint creak from somewhere, maybe the plumbing. I brushed it off, assuming it was part of the charm the listing had promised. When I finally climbed into bed, I noticed a subtle odor lingering in the air, not overpowering but distinct, like damp metal, faint and sharp. At first, I thought it was the pipes, or maybe some moisture in the old floorboards, and I didn't pay much attention. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, feeling the weight of silence in the wide-open fields outside. I woke suddenly around midnight, heart racing. The room was dark, but my phone's dim light caught something in the corner of my vision. It was the closet, and I could hear its soft, measured breathing. At first, I convinced myself it was a dream, a trick of exhaustion. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The breathing continued for a few long seconds, uneven and deliberate, and then stopped as I fumbled for my phone to shine a light directly at the closet door. Nothing moved. The air felt heavier in that instant, as though it had thickened around me. My pulse spiked. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping my phone, and stared at the closet until my eyes adjusted, watching for the slightest hint of movement. There was none. I tried to tell myself it was a branch brushing the window outside or the house settling, but it didn't feel like that. The sound had come from inside. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept the light on, watching the corner where the closet stood, and every time I heard a floorboard creak or a gust of wind against the siding, my pulse jumped. I didn't dare move to check the closet fully. I stayed huddled in the bed until the first rays of dawn spilled through the windows. Morning brought a strange relief, but also new details I hadn't noticed. The closet door, which I had been certain was shut all night, was slightly ajar. The edge of the door was scratched, shallow grooves etched into the wood that hadn't been there when I arrived. My stomach sank as I tried to piece it together. The door opened farther than it should have, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The floor was cold and dusty, and I could see the faint outline of the original wood beams supporting the wall. Someone could have been hiding there while I slept. My hands shook as I backed away from the closet, the realization crashing over me. I packed quickly, leaving most of my things where they were, my stomach tight with tension. Every shadow in the room seemed sharper, every creak of the floor louder, as if the house itself were aware of what I had discovered. I didn't look back as I moved through the small kitchen and out the front door. The sun was higher now, bright on the fields, but the light did nothing to calm the cold knot in my chest. I got into my car, doors locked, and didn't start the engine until I was a safe distance from the driveway, far enough to keep the farmhouse behind me in my rearview mirror. Once I was home, I called Airbnb. I reported what had happened, emphasizing the crawl space and the scratching on the closet door, and requested that the listing be investigated. Within a few days, the listing disappeared entirely. The sense of relief was muted. I kept imagining what could have happened if I hadn't checked the closet or if the breathing hadn't stopped when I shined the light. The possibility that someone had been inside the house while I slept, watching me, hiding in the shadows just a few feet away, lingered in my mind like a faint, persistent echo. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a previous tenant, a curious worker who had left something behind, but nothing fit. The crawl space wasn't accessible without moving the closet door, and the scratches were fresh. Someone had been there recently. The thought replayed itself in my mind, unbidden. Whenever I closed a door or entered a dark room, I started checking the locks more carefully, double-checking closets and cupboards before settling in for the night. I realized how easily a small oversight, a few seconds of inattention, could have put me in danger. It wasn't just fear of the physical act. It was the breach of privacy. The idea that the space I had assumed to be mine, however temporary, had been shared without my knowledge. The farmhouse, the fields, the rusted swing on the porch, all of it became tainted with that knowledge. Even weeks later, whenever I thought of rustic experiences or countryside getaways, the memory of the closet, the narrow crawl space, and the sound of deliberate breathing came back uninvited. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm traveling alone. I imagine what would have happened if I had gone straight to sleep, or if the light hadn't startled whoever or whatever was hiding there. The thought is sharp, like the smell of damp metal in the air, sudden and vivid. I've stayed in other Airbnbs since then, but I always check every corner of a room, every closet, every darkened space before I relax. That farmhouse was the first place that taught me not to assume safety just because a listing looks wholesome or familiar. The memory remains clear, as detailed and tactile as the house itself. The creak of the floorboards, the faint odor, the narrow crawl space barely hidden behind the closet, and the scratches in the wood. They all exist in my mind in full, undeniable clarity. I've never returned to that area, and I don't intend to, but every so often I'll catch myself picturing that bedroom, imagining what might have happened if I hadn't noticed the door or if I hadn't checked. The chills hit every time, but so does a sense of relief, a reminder that paying attention, even in small ways, saved me from something I can't fully describe but can never forget. It ended clearly. I left the farmhouse, reported the listing, and it was removed. Nothing more happened, and I never went back. But the experience reshaped how I travel, how I inhabit spaces, and how I trust or don't trust the promises in online listings. It's a memory that is both terrifying and grounding. A small, sharp lesson learned in the countryside silence, behind a closet door that never should have been open. I had been traveling for work for weeks and finally booked an Airbnb in a small town tucked along a winding stretch of road in upstate New York. It was late October, and the air had that sharp, clean chill that made every breath feel alive. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I could focus and not deal with people. The listing seemed perfect, an old farmhouse converted into a rental, surrounded by dense woods, with a dirt driveway that led to a small parking area. The photos showed a cozy interior, exposed beams, a working fireplace, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades but was clean and charming. The price was cheap, which should have been a warning, but at that moment it just seemed like a lucky find. When I arrived, it was just getting dark. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long, sharp shadows across the property. The house was isolated, no other houses in sight, just the forest pressing close on all sides. I parked, grabbed my bag, and approached the front door. The wood creaked under my boots, and the smell of damp leaves and old wood filled the air. The lock turned easily. The owner had left a key in the lockbox, as instructed. Inside, the house smelled faintly of mildew and wood polish. It had that dusty, untouched feel, like no one had lived there permanently for years. I put my bag down and started exploring. The living room had a small couch, a couple of chairs, and a coffee table cluttered with old magazines and a thin layer of dust. I noticed that every window had heavy curtains, some drawn, some half open. They weren't damaged, but they blocked most of the light. I pulled them all open to let in what little daylight remained. The kitchen was smaller than I expected. The fridge hummed quietly, and the sink had a faint odor, but nothing unbearable. There were basic utensils and a few plates and mugs in the cabinets. The stove looked old but functional. I unpacked a few things, set up my laptop on the dining table, and settled in. I wanted to get some work done, so I left my phone on the table and plugged in my laptop. By the time I looked up, it was fully dark outside. The house felt larger at night, with long shadows stretching along the walls. The wood creaked under my weight, and the wind rattled the window panes. It was quiet in a way that made me conscious of every little sound. My own movements, the hum of the fridge, the occasional tap of a branch against the window. I brushed it off. This was the kind of isolation I liked. Around 10:30, I decided to check out the bedrooms. There were 2 upstairs. The stairs groaned with every step, and the railing felt thin under my hand. The first bedroom was small, with a narrow bed and a dresser. It smelled faintly of old perfume, the kind of scent that lingers long after someone leaves. The second bedroom was larger, with a bed that seemed to sag in the middle. I opened the windows to air it out, and the moonlight spilled in across the floorboards, revealing dust and tiny scratches in the wood. I made the bed, double-checked the locks, and went back downstairs to the living room. That's when I noticed something odd. The door to the basement, which I hadn't checked, was slightly ajar. I could see the darkness beyond it, no light at all. I didn't remember opening it. My first thought was that maybe I had, absent-mindedly, while exploring, but I was sure I had closed it. I went over, reached for the handle, and paused. The basement smelled different, earthy, damp, with a hint of something metallic. Not terrible, just distinct. I closed it and decided to leave it alone. I didn't want to go downstairs in the dark. Around midnight, I went to bed. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I heard branches scraping the house and the faint sound of small animals moving outside. I had trouble sleeping, not because of fear, but because every little noise made me conscious of the house's age and isolation. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a scraping sound from the living room. It was faint, like someone moving a chair. I froze. After a few moments, I realized it could be the wind moving the furniture or an animal outside. I told myself it was nothing and tried to sleep again. The scraping repeated, now closer, like it was moving along the floorboards. My heart rate went up, but I stayed in bed, listening. The sound stopped after a few minutes. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m., light dozing, always listening. The next morning, I explored more carefully. I opened every door, checked the windows, and even went outside. Everything looked normal. Nothing had been moved. The house was quiet, the way a place like that should be. I had breakfast, brewed coffee in the old drip machine, and sat by the window watching the woods. The isolation was peaceful, but it kept me on edge. I decided to go into the basement during the day. The stairs were steep and narrow. The air was colder down there. There was a faint, musty smell, stronger than upstairs. The basement was empty except for a few boxes stacked against the far wall, cobwebs, and some old tools. Nothing out of place. I walked around, checked corners, even looked under the workbench. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently. Still, the feeling lingered. A faint unease, like the house wasn't entirely empty. I spent the day hiking a trail I had seen on a map nearby, trying to shake the anxiety. When I came back, the sun was setting. I made dinner, lit the fireplace, and tried to relax. I noticed that a few items in the kitchen had been slightly moved, but I chalked it up to me not paying attention. The house felt less oppressive in the warm glow of firelight. That night, I slept without incident. I started noticing patterns in the house's sounds, the way the pipes groaned, how the wood shifted as the temperature dropped. Everything was explainable, ordinary, human. The wind, the settling of the house, the occasional animal outside. On my last morning, I did a final walkthrough. I opened all the windows, checked all the rooms, and even went into the basement one more time. I wanted to leave nothing behind that would make the next guest uneasy. That's when I noticed a small detail I had missed before. On the back of the door to the basement, someone had scratched a simple marking, just a small crosshatch of lines. It was old, probably carved years ago, but it confirmed what I had felt. The house had a history. People had lived there, explored there, left marks. That was it. There was no one there now, no mystery beyond the fact that old houses carry traces of those who came before. I packed my things, locked the doors, and left. Driving away, I felt lighter, almost relieved. The house had been eerie in its silence and isolation, but it had also been perfectly normal. It was the kind of place that got under your skin, made you hyper-aware, but ultimately, everything could be explained. The old scratches, the creaks, the sounds, they were just signs of age and human presence, not something sinister. By the time I reached the main road, sunlight was spilling across the hills, and I realized I hadn't felt that alert, that alive in a long time. The Airbnb had been unsettling, yes, but it had also reminded me of something I'd forgotten in the noise of daily life. The world is full of quiet, strange places, and sometimes simply noticing them is enough to be unsettled. Not everything needs an answer, not everything is dangerous, and some of the most unnerving experiences are the ones you can actually explain. I never returned to that Airbnb, but I've thought about it often. Not with fear, but with a quiet respect for how ordinary spaces can feel extraordinary when you're alone in them. It reminded me that discomfort and unease are natural, even in safe places, and that sometimes the mind creates stories out of nothing. Yet the truth is often simpler, calmer, and just as memorable. I rented the room because it was close to the office and cheap enough to justify a week. I was in town for interviews and wanted something stable, not a hotel that reminded me I was passing through. The listing said private room in a shared apartment. One other tenant, male, quiet. That sounded manageable. The building was newer than the photos suggested. Clean lobby, cameras over the doors, a keypad that logged entries. The apartment itself was tidy in a practiced way. Surfaces cleared, nothing personal left out. The room I rented held a bed, a desk, a lamp that hummed faintly. The closet was narrow, the kind that forces clothes to hang in a straight line. I never saw the other tenant. The first evening, I assumed our schedules didn't line up. I ate a simple dinner and went over notes for the next day. When I came back from the shower, the couch cushions had been rearranged. Not messy, just different. One turned vertical, another stacked at the arm. I thought I had done it myself earlier, shifting while I sat. I put them back and went to bed. The next morning, the TV was warm. I noticed because I set my hand down to steady myself while tying my shoes and felt heat through the glass. The plug lay on the floor, not connected. I checked the outlet. Nothing. TVs hold heat, I told myself. Residual warmth lingers. I unplugged it again anyway and left. Food appeared in the fridge. Carton of milk I hadn't bought. A plastic container with leftovers that smelled off by the time I noticed. Then they disappeared. I chalked it up to the other tenant cleaning out his things. Shared spaces blur ownership. I labeled my items with a marker to be clear. Each night, the apartment shifted. Cushions moved. A chair angled differently. The bathroom mirror fogged when I had not showered. Once, a damp towel hung over the rack. Not mine. I began to pay attention to small things, the way the floor creaked near the kitchen at times when I was alone in my room. I never heard footsteps, just the aftereffect of use. One morning, I found a second toothbrush in the cup beside the sink. Same brand as mine. Same color. I stared at it longer than made sense. I had bought mine at a pharmacy down the street because I'd forgotten to pack one. It was a common brand, but the color choice felt specific. I lined them up. The bristles were equally worn. I checked the listing again. One other tenant. Male. Quiet. I messaged the host with what I had noticed, keeping it factual. The response was firm. No one else had access. The other tenant worked nights and kept to his room. Building security logs showed no entries during the night. The implication was clear. Nothing unusual was happening. I went to the building manager during a break between interviews. I asked about access, about whether units had secondary entrances or shared keys. The manager pulled logs and showed me entries. My code in and out. A maintenance entry earlier in the week. Nothing else overnight. Cameras showed the hall empty. That night, the TV was warm again. This time, I knew it had been unplugged because I had wrapped the cord and placed it on the shelf. The cord lay straight on the floor when I found it, the plug still not in the outlet. The heat faded under my hand as I stood there. I unplugged it anyway, even though it wasn't plugged in. I slept poorly. In the morning, I decided to leave a day early. My last interview was done. The room had given me enough. I packed and checked the closet to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. Inside the door, taped at eye level, was a folded paper. It was a lease agreement. Not printed cleanly, but copied, the kind landlords reuse. 2 names filled the lines. One was the host's, the other was mine. Handwritten, dated 3 years earlier. I sat on the bed and read it through. The terms were standard. Monthly rent. Utilities included. No pets. The signature matched my name in a rough hand that was not mine. I felt a cold, steady pressure settle behind my eyes. I took photos of everything. The lease, the tape, the toothbrushes. I checked out without ceremony and left the key on the desk. On the way out, I stopped by the manager again and showed him the lease. He frowned and asked for a copy. The explanation came later, after calls and emails and a day to breathe. The host had been running an illegal room arrangement for years, cycling short stays through the same bedroom while claiming a single long-term tenant on paper to satisfy insurance and lease terms. The lease taped inside the closet door was a template he reused, filled in by hand for records he kept himself. My name was not unique. Previous tenant had shared it. 3 years earlier, that person had signed, and the host had never removed the paper. The other tenant existed. He worked nights. He used the common spaces when he thought no one was home, careful to unplug the TV when he finished, rearranging cushions without thought. He bought the same toothbrush because it was cheap and available in bulk at the nearby store. Food appeared and disappeared because 2 people shared a fridge without acknowledging each other's schedules. The building logs showed no entries because he was already inside. The cameras saw nothing because nothing crossed the threshold. The host denied responsibility until confronted with records and complaints. The listing was taken down. I got my money back. I did not get the job. What stayed with me was not fear of something unseen, but the realization of how easily lives overlap without contact, how a shared space can hold 2 routines that never meet. The apartment had been occupied the whole time. I just wasn't meant to notice. We rented the place because it was far and the world had folded in on itself. June 2020 had turned cities into closed rooms. 4 of us wanted air that did not feel shared. Northern Minnesota promised space and quiet. The listing said isolated but peaceful. That sounded like a solution. The drive took hours after pavement narrowed and then broke. The last stretch was gravel with standing water in the ruts from spring melt. Pines crowded the road. The lake appeared without warning, a flat pane of gray-blue tucked between trees. The cabin sat back from the shore on short stilts, weathered cedar, low roof, a crawl space beneath. No dock, no neighbors, no bars on the phone. That was the point. The lake was still in a way that did not read as calm. Wind moved the treetops. Leaves flashed silver and dark. The water did not answer. It stayed smooth, holding the sky without a ripple. I have been around lakes. Even sheltered ones twitch. This one did not. It looked like something set down rather than formed. We unloaded and spread out. Confirmed locks. Checked windows. Old place simple, clean enough. The smell inside was pine cleaner and damp wood. The floorboards dipped near the door. The crawlspace door hung on one hinge, closed but not sealed. I nudged it with my shoe and it swung, then settled back. I told myself to fix it later. The first afternoon passed quietly. We walked the shoreline, boots sinking into the soft band where land gives up. There were no waves, just a faint line where water met soil. Insects hovered above the surface without touching it. I watched a dragonfly hover and dart and stop again, its shadow pinned to the same place on the lake. It was near evening when I noticed the reflection. We stood near the water, for shapes cut into the sky's copy. I lifted my hand to brush a mosquito away and saw my arm rise in the lake a beat late. Not much, a fraction. Enough that my body felt it before my head caught up. I did it again, slower. The reflection followed, delayed by the smallest slice of time. I told myself it was my angle, the light, my own attention slipping. The surface was so flat it magnified tiny things. The brain looks for patterns when it is bored. I did not say anything. I stepped back and watched the trees instead. Their reflections seemed fine, though I did not test them. That night, the air dropped fast. We sat inside with the windows open, listening to loons far out, the sound carrying clean across the water. Later, when lights were off and we lay on separate beds, something moved along the shoreline. Not splashing, not quick. The waterline bent inward as if pressed by weight. The shape was suggested by absence rather than form, a long inward curve that slid and paused again. I watched from the window until my eyes watered. The shape never broke the surface. It stayed just enough within it to move water without showing itself. I thought of moose. I thought of beaver. Both are common. Both move water. Neither matched the pace. This was slower, deliberate, as if testing footing. Morning showed wet impressions along the shore. Not clear prints. Depressions where something heavy had stood. They led from the lake toward the cabin and ended at the crawlspace. The door hung open now. The earth beneath was dark and damp, churned. I crouched and looked without touching. The marks were wide and shallow, not clawed. Dragged soil marked the beam where something had pushed past. We did not talk about it directly. We cleaned up breakfast with care and left the dishes to dry. Someone taped the crawlspace door back in place with a strip from a first aid kit. The lake stayed flat. The sky slid over it without disturbance. The second evening repeated the first. The reflection lag was there again, easier to see now that I was looking. A blink behind, a hand afterthought. I stepped back and let the trees fill my view. At night, the waterline bent again. The movement stayed closer to the cabin this time. I heard a soft contact under the floor, not a scratch, not a scuttle. A pressure, then release. Sleep came thin. I kept the image of the crawlspace beam in my head. The scraped dirt, the way the door had been set to swing inward rather than out. We packed early the next morning without naming a reason. Bags zipped. Trash gathered. The tape came off the crawlspace door. It swung and settled open again, as if it preferred it that way. On the drive out, once we had service again, I looked up the lake. No name, just a blue dot on a map. I kept searching. County records showed a shallow basin fed by springs. Low outflow, high organic content. In certain light, water like that can look still when it moves. Dense water carries waves differently. It can delay the visible response to motion. The reflection lag had a name. It was an optical effect tied to surface tension and angle, made more noticeable when the surface is smooth and the eye expects immediate feedback. I kept reading. Moose use lakes in early summer to feed on submerged plants and to cool. They move slowly. They press water without splashing. They leave broad impressions and push through crawl spaces to escape insects and heat. Bears do too, though less often near open water. The marks under the cabin fit a moose better. The height, the weight, the lack of tearing. The explanation sat heavy and then settled. It accounted for the waterline bending, the impressions, the pressure under the floor. It did not need anything else. The crawlspace door had been left that way for a reason. The lake stayed flat because of its makeup, not intent. Our reflections lagged because of physics, not attention. We never went back. The platform refunded part of the stay without asking for detail. I keep a photo from that trip on my phone. It shows the lake at dusk, trees dark, sky pale, water holding it all without comment. When I look at it, the delay is gone. A still image cannot keep a beat. I booked the place while backpacking through the UK because it looked clean and simple. One floor, one bedroom, a kitchen you could cross in 3 steps. The photos showed pale walls, a small window, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. It felt like a place meant for one person passing through. That fit me. I was moving every few days, keeping my bag light, choosing places where I could sleep and leave without ceremony. The street was older than the listing suggested. Stone fronts darkened by years of rain. A narrow pavement that forced people to pass single file. The front door opened straight into the kitchen. No hall, no buffer. The air smelled faintly of damp and cleaning spray. Everything was tidy in the way rentals are tidy. Wiped down and stripped of any sign that someone had stayed long enough to leave a mark. I set my bag down and did what I always do first. I looked for exits. The kitchen door led to the street. The bedroom door led to the only other room. Between them, near the back wall, was a narrow door I had not expected. It was flush with the wall and painted the same color, easy to miss unless you were already scanning. I assumed it led to storage or a utility closet. Old houses hide things where they can. The door wasn't locked. I opened it because it was there. Behind it was a staircase, steep and tight, with bare wood steps worn thin at the center. The light switch was inside the doorway, not outside. When I flipped it, the bulb above came on at once. No delay, no flicker. That stood out. I had assumed storage would be dark and cold. This was neither. At the top of the stairs was a furnished room. Not half-finished, not dusty. A bed with a clean cover pulled tight. A small table with a glass of water placed at the edge, clear and full. A heater under the window that was already warm, the metal ticking softly as it held temperature. The air smelled lived in. Not stale, not fresh, just used. I stood there longer than I meant to. The listing photos did not show this room. The description did not mention a second level. The host profile said they lived abroad. I checked again, standing there with my phone in my hand. Nothing about an upstairs space. Nothing about shared accommodation. Nothing about additional access. I told myself it was overflow from a previous stay that had not been cleaned yet. A mistake. I did not touch anything. I backed down the stairs and closed the door. The latch caught easily. Too easily. I went into the bedroom that was meant for me and unpacked what little I had. I put my boots by the door, wiped the soles on the mat until no dirt came off, and made tea. The first night was quiet until it wasn't. Old buildings make noise. Pipes knock. Floors settle. I lay on the bed and listened to the hum of the heater, the distant sound of traffic dampened by stone. Then I heard slow pacing overhead. Not fast, not heavy. Measured steps that crossed the room and turned back. I sat up, waiting for my body to adjust to the sound. It did not. I remembered the room above and felt a small, cold clarity settle in. I was already upstairs. There was no level above that room, not that I had seen. I got up and stood in the center of the floor, listening. The steps continued, passing over where my head would be if I lay back down. I told myself sound travels strangely in old houses, that footsteps can echo from neighboring buildings, that my sense of direction was off. I waited until the pacing stopped. It did eventually. I slept in short stretches. The next day I walked the city until my legs ached. I wanted to feel normal again, to let the place recede into something minor. When I returned, the narrow door was closed as I had left it. I did not open it. I cooked a simple meal and ate standing. That night the pacing came back, earlier this time, slower. It lasted longer. I checked the stairs after it stopped. No sign of use. No new marks. The wood was dry and pale, worn smooth by years, not recent traffic. I slept again in pieces. On the third night I came back late. Rain had started, the fine kind that soaks without noise. I took off my jacket and set it to dry. When I turned toward the stairs, I saw the footprints. Mud tracked down from the top step toward the kitchen. Clear prints, each toe defined, each heel pressed deep. They led down, not up. My boots were still by the door, clean and dry where I had left them. I crouched and looked closer. The mud was fresh, wet at the edges. It smelled like the street after rain. I followed the prints with my eyes until they faded near the sink. as if someone had paused there, then stepped carefully away. I did not go upstairs again. I packed what I needed and left the rest. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the rain, pulling it closed behind me. I did not check out through the app. I did not message the host. I found another place and paid more than I wanted to. I slept there with the door locked and the light on. Weeks later, after I was home, an email came from the platform. It asked whether I had used the second accommodation as agreed. The wording was formal, detached, as if it referred to a checkbox I had missed. I read it twice and then once more. There was no confusion in the language. It assumed knowledge I did not have, consent I had not given. I reported the listing. I sent photos of the staircase and the footprints. I described the pacing and the furnished room. I kept to facts. The response took time. When it came, it explained enough to close the loop. The building had been split without permits. The host rented the lower level as a single unit while allowing a caretaker to use the upper space when the host was away. The caretaker accessed the upper room through the narrow staircase and, when weather or timing required, moved through the lower kitchen to reach a rear exit not shown in the listing. The heater stayed on to prevent damp. The glass of water was set out daily. The pacing was someone walking the length of the room above, not realizing or not caring that the sound carried. The muddy prints were from a return during the rain, a route taken because it was faster and unobserved. The platform removed the listing. The account was suspended. I was refunded and offered a credit I did not use. I did not need compensation. I needed the explanation to sit still in my head. Nothing supernatural had happened. No hidden presence beyond what a contract had concealed. The fear came from the gap between what was promised and what was true, from realizing that another person had been moving through my space without acknowledgement. I still travel. I still book places meant for one. When I arrive now, I look for narrow doors painted to match the wall. If I find one, I leave. I took the trip because the house was already empty. The marriage had been empty for a long time before the papers made it official, and I needed miles, not people. I drove alone, chose routes that faded off the map, booked places that promised quiet and delivered distance. The desert worked for that. Space stripped of decoration. Silence that stayed put. The house sat at the end of a dirt road that curled away from pavement and then forgot itself. No mailbox, no fence. The nearest structure was a low shed half collapsed by wind and sun. The listing called it authentic desert living. I read that as isolation with running water. The building was old but recently painted, the kind of paint job meant to hide age rather than restore it. The front door was steel-skinned, heavy, and the lock turned with a soft drag, like a tooth missing in a gear. When it closed, it did not sit flush. A thin line of daylight showed along the jamb until I pressed it with my shoulder. Inside, the air smelled of dust and lemon cleaner. The floors were bare concrete. The furniture was spare and light, placed away from walls as if the room itself were the feature. I set my bag down and did what I always do first. I checked doors. The bathroom door had a knob that turned freely with no latch click. The bedroom was the same. A closet with sliding panels had no hardware at all. Only the front door had a lock, and even that felt wrong. I told myself that desert places were built rough. Function over finish. I wiped down the kitchen counter out of habit, even though it was already clean. I laid my keys on a hook by the door. I made a simple dinner and ate standing, watching the light drain out of the windows. The house creaked as the temperature fell, a series of small complaints that came from beams and pipes. I had heard it before in cabins and rentals. Sound traveled far in dry air. It did not need help. Sometime after dark, my phone buzzed with a message from the host. I did not open it right away. I had learned to let notifications sit. When I did read it, it referred to a second key and asked whether I had found it. There was no explanation. I searched the drawers and the bowl by the door, checked the table by the couch, the counter again. Nothing. I replied asking what he meant. The message showed as sent and then stayed that way. The wind came up fast. It did not rise. It arrived. The house shuddered with it. Dust hissed against the windows. Somewhere behind the house, something tapped the wall. Not in a pattern, not steady. A single contact, then a pause, then too close together. I stood in the kitchen and listened with my hands flat on the counter, feeling the vibration come through the slab. I pictured loose tin, a branch dragged by gusts, a screen not properly secured. I walked the back door and checked the latch. It held. The tapping moved higher, then stopped. The wind roared on without it. I went to bed early because there was nothing else to do. The bedroom door closed with a soft touch and stayed that way, unlatched. I lay on top of the covers with the lamp off, eyes open, counting breaths, letting the place settle around me. I told myself what I had told myself in other strange rooms. The house was empty. Noise did not equal intent. The host lived somewhere else. The road was long and ugly. No one passed without purpose. Sometime near midnight, the tapping returned, closer to the bedroom wall. It was not rhythmic. It did not sound like testing. It sounded like contact without commitment. I lay still and waited for it to become something else. It did not. It stopped and started, then stopped for good. The wind eased. The house cooled and sighed. I slept in pieces. Morning came hard and bright. The desert does not do gentle. I woke with a dry mouth and the sense of having missed something important. The kitchen light showed dust that had not been there before. A fine coat settled along the sill and the edge of the counter. I made coffee and stood at the sink, staring at the line of dirt road stretching out toward nothing. When I turned, I saw the key. It lay on a folded napkin at the center of the counter, placed with care. The metal was old, heavy, not a copy cut from a kiosk. The bow was worn smooth, the teeth deep. I knew it had not been there. I had cleaned the counter myself, moved everything off it, wiped it down, put nothing back. I picked the key up and felt its weight. I did not smell oil or dust on it. It was clean. I did not message the host. I did not touch anything else. I walked the house again. No signs of entry that I could see. No mud on the floor. The front door still did not sit right. The back wall showed no mark where something had tapped. Outside, the ground was hard and packed, marked by old tire tracks and the faint traces of animals. Wind erased things here. It also revealed them. I saw nothing fresh. The key fit the bedroom door. It turned smoothly and engaged a latch I had not felt before. The door closed with a different sound when locked, a muted finality. I stood there with my hand on the knob and tried to understand why that mattered. I packed slowly, methodically. I did not rush because panic makes mistakes. I checked the time on my receipt. Check-in had been the afternoon before. Check-out was the next day. I still had the place. I also had a car and daylight. I loaded my bag, wiped my prints from the counter out of habit, and left the key on the napkin where it was. I pulled the door closed and turned the lock, caught after a moment, then held. I drove toward town and did not look back. I stopped at a gas station and used their restroom, locked the door, stood there longer than needed, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. I checked my phone. There was no new message. Later, with distance and coffee and signal, I went through the listing again. The photos showed the bedroom door from one angle only, the knob turned away. The description mentioned a main key and a backup kept on site for emergencies. It did not say where. Reviews praised the quiet, the stars, the feeling of being alone. One review mentioned the host being attentive in a way that felt generous. I thought about the timing. The host had asked about the second key after I arrived. If there was a backup hidden somewhere obvious, the message would not have been needed. If the host had intended to meet me, the message would have said so. The tapping had not been rhythmic because it had not been meant to signal. It had been meant to check sound, to see how the house responded, whether anyone moved. The placement of the key had been careful because it was meant to be seen. A reminder, a test. I contacted the platform and reported the lock issue and the key. I kept it factual. No speculation. They responded with apologies and a credit. The host account went dark a week later. The listing disappeared. I do not know why, and I do not need to. I know what mattered. There had been no ghosts, no tricks of light, no desert magic. There had been a house with doors that did not lock and a person who knew how to be present without being seen. The desert had done what it always does. It stripped away noise and left only what was real. I kept driving after that, but I stopped choosing places that bragged about emptiness. I learned that isolation is not the same as safety, and that sometimes the most honest warning is a key placed where it cannot be ignored. I rented the place because it was cheap and close to a trade conference. It sat on the outskirts of Columbus, where the city thinned into wide roads and half-finished neighborhoods. Snow had been pushed into gray piles along the curbs. The houses looked similar, all sharp angles and bare siding, some with porches that had never been stained. It felt temporary, like a place built to be occupied later but already aging. The listing said private home, no host on site. That mattered to me. I wanted quiet. I wanted to come back late, sleep, and leave early. I parked in the narrow driveway and carried my bag inside. The lockbox code worked. The door opened into a short hallway with laminate floors that had been mopped too often with cheap cleaner. The heat was on high. The air smelled like dust cooked onto metal. Old heat has a smell that lingers in the throat. The living room had a couch, a table, and a standing lamp. No books, no photos. The walls were bare but uneven. Small nail holes dotted the paint in clusters, like outlines of frames that had been removed in a hurry. Some holes had been filled, others had not. The TV stand was there without a TV. The kitchen was clean and empty. 3 plates, 3 cups, 1 pan. The cabinets were new, but the handles were worn. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms. One had a mattress still wrapped in plastic. The other had a made bed and a dresser with empty drawers. The bathroom smelled of bleach and wet grout. Everything worked. Nothing felt used in a human way. I unpacked, ate takeout, and reviewed my notes for the next day. Snow kept falling in fine sheets. The neighborhood stayed quiet. No dogs, no kids, no cars passing. The silence felt thick but not alarming. I had stayed in places like this before. People stripped houses down for rentals. It was normal. I went to the basement to drop my extra bag. The stairs were steep and narrow. The basement ceiling was low. Exposed joists ran across with wires stapled along them. The concrete floor was clean. There was a washer and dryer on one side and shelves with nothing on them. Against the far wall sat a single chair. It was a folding chair, metal frame, plastic seat. It faced a blank wall at close distance. No table, no screen, no reason for it to be there. An extension cord ran from the wall near the chair and disappeared up through a hole in the ceiling. The cord was thick and new. I stood there longer than I needed to. The chair made the space feel smaller. Basements usually had clutter. This one did not. I moved my bag to the shelves and went back upstairs. I told myself it was a leftover from some project. I told myself to stop inventing reasons to be uneasy. That night, I lay in bed with the lights off. The heat clicked on and off. Pipes shifted. Snow tapped the windows. At some point, my phone buzzed as it connected to Wi-Fi. I had not entered a password. The network name popped up on the screen. Basement_feed. I assumed it belonged to a neighbor with a bad sense of humor. The signal was full. I turned off Wi-Fi and went to sleep. I woke later with my phone glowing on the nightstand. Wi-Fi was back on. The same network. I turned it off again and put the phone face down. I slept in short stretches. Each time I woke, the house sounded the same. No footsteps, no doors, just heat and wind. In the morning, I showered and dressed. While brushing my teeth, I noticed the Wi-Fi icon again. Full bars. I checked the available networks. Only one showed strong signal. Basement_feed. I walked through the house with the phone in my hand. The signal never dipped. Even in the bathroom, even in the back bedroom. That was not how neighbors' routers behaved. I went down to the basement. The signal stayed full. I looked at the extension cord again. It led to a small hole drilled clean through the floor above the chair. The laundry room was next to the stairs. On the wall above the dryer was a steel box bolted into the studs. Conduit ran into it. A small antenna poked out through a cut in the drywall. The box had a padlock. There was a power cable going in and another going out. I recognized the setup from work sites, a router with a battery backup. I unplugged the power cable feeding the box. The Wi-Fi dropped at once. I waited. The house felt quieter without the hum I had not noticed before. I went to the conference and tried to focus. All day I thought about the chair and the wall it faced. I thought about the extension cord and the hole. I told myself the owner might be running a home server. I told myself to ask for a refund later. When I returned that evening, the snow had stopped. The driveway had not been shoveled. No new footprints marked it. Inside, the heat was on. The air smelled the same. I checked the steel box. The power cable was still unplugged. I went upstairs, ate, and sat on the couch. I kept my phone on the table. 2:14 a.m. it vibrated. The screen lit up with a notification. New device connected. I did not have Wi-Fi on. I checked anyway. Basement_feed was back. Full strength. I went to the laundry room. The steel box hummed. The cable I had unplugged was plugged in. The padlock hung closed. The outlet showed fresh scuffs where the plug had been pulled and pushed back. I stood there listening. No movement upstairs. No sound outside. The hum had a steady rhythm. I unplugged the cable again and stayed in the room. The hum faded. I waited 10 minutes. It did not return. I did not sleep. I sat on the bed with the lights on and my coat on. I kept the phone in my hand. The Wi-Fi stayed off. Nothing else happened. When morning came, gray and flat, I packed fast. Before leaving, I went back to the basement. The chair was no longer square to the wall. It had been turned a few degrees, angled toward the stairs. The extension cord lay the same way. The floor showed no scuff marks except a faint arc where the chair legs had shifted. I took photos. I left. I did not lock the door. In my car, I checked my phone. The Wi-Fi list showed basement_feed again, weak now, fading as I drove away. I reported the listing and sent the photos. I also filed a report with the local police department. An officer called me back 2 days later. The house belonged to a man who owned several rentals in the area. He had installed a closed network for cameras. The steel box held a router with a cellular modem and a battery backup. It did not rely on the house power. The extension cord fed a small camera mounted above the basement ceiling, aimed at the chair and the stairs. There were others. One in the living room smoke detector, one in the hallway vent, none in the bathroom or bedrooms, according to the officer, but the setup allowed remote access and local recording. The network name had been set by the owner. The chair faced the wall because the camera faced the chair. The wall hid a conduit path and a removable panel behind fresh paint. The owner used the basement to test angles and signal strength. The chair had been turned because someone had come down after I unplugged the router to check the stairs and reposition it. The battery backup kept the system alive long enough to send the notification. When I unplugged it again and stayed there, the system went dark. No one entered the house while I was inside. The owner had a key, but the logs showed remote connections at night, not physical entry. The listing was removed. The owner claimed ignorance and blamed a contractor. The officer did not sound convinced. I received a refund and a short apology email that said nothing specific. I still think about the smell of old heat and dust, about the nail holes where photos had been taken down but not patched right, about a chair placed to face a blank wall for no reason that made sense until it did. I think about how the Wi-Fi stayed strong in every room because it was meant to. I no longer rent places with no host on site. I no longer ignore small things that feel wrong. I left that house knowing exactly what it was, and that clarity was worse than not knowing at all.